During World War II, many Americans were focused obviously on immediately winning the war, but there was also a concern with what would come next, especially after 1943, when the tide of the war seems to be shifting in favor of the Allies. And many Americans wanted to talk about what the world would look like after war as a way of focusing on hope, right? That we will win the war, that there will be positive changes associated. And so many Americans talk about what will happen after the war, also because there's this fear that post war, the United States will slide back into the Great Depression. That is definitely a not unfounded fear, given that usually there is, after every war, a bit of economic recession as the economy adjusts to a time of peace rather than war, and we make the switch back from war material production to consumer materials. Many people talk about this vision of post war prosperity and how we can ensure the level of economic prosperity we're seeing during World War II continues after World War II. Many Americans start to promote the idea of free enterprise. So, in other words, to continue this economic production by avoiding excessive regulation of business and economy so that businesses can maximize their production and their profit. The idea as well for these businesses in promoting this notion of limiting regulation was that the war would produce a natural bump in spending after the shift back to consumer production, in part because it was impossible for consumers to buy a lot of products during the war because companies just aren't producing them on the same scale. They're busy producing war materials. And a lot of Americans are doing financially well, getting work in these factories, right, making a lot of money with nothing to spend it on. So there's this idea that there's going to be this kind of pent up money and demand for consumer products, and then Americans will want to and be able to spend on consumer products following the shift back to peacetime. So essentially, what a lot of these American companies were promoting in talking about what World War II should look like was an embrace of what we call laissez faire economics. Laissez faire is French for let it be. The idea, again, that the economy should proceed with a minimum level of regulation. So, this is a pushback to the Great Depression, in which the first response of the first New Deal was to increase regulation because they felt that an excess of capitalism, business and the economy running unchecked, had led to the collapse of the economy and the Great Depression in the first place. In looking towards support for their idea of minimal regulation, a lot of businessmen cited the work of an Austrian economist named Friedrich Hayek, who wrote The Road to Serfdom in 1944. And in his book, Hayek argued that excessive government involvement in the economy was what led to dictatorship and tyranny, looking at the examples of Germany and Italy in particular. And so a lot of people, even still today, look at Hayek's book and make the argument that that justifies us not regulating the economy at all, or only in very little, because there's this fear that it will give the government too much power if we allow the government to regulate the economy. However, if you fully read Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom, Hayek doesn't just say excess regulation leads to tyranny, but he also says a completely unregulated economy is also abusive. So what Hayek is arguing for in his book, The Road to Serfdom, is a middle ground. So he says pure capitalism abuses the worker and the consumer. Excessively regulated capitalism will lead to governmental power and tyranny. So let's occupy middle ground. So what Hayek promoted was basic worker protections like a minimum wage, maximum working hours, antitrust laws to prevent the formation of monopolies, and the creation of a social safety net. So Hayek is much more moderate than a lot of people make him out to be today. When we look at the role that the United States government and people should have in the world after World War II, we have a couple of competing viewpoints. Henry Luce, who is a famous newspaper publisher and magnate, published a pamphlet called The American Century in 1941. So early on in the war, he's pretty positive and confident about America's ability to win the war. Luce made the argument that America should accept its destiny as a major world power and use this power to actively promote American industry and democracy. So, what's interesting about this is traditionally the conversation around the United States government had been that the United States should serve as a model for other nations. So, think of it like the City on the Hill sermon from Puritan New England, right? The idea that America was going to be this model, shining example for how the rest of the world should approach democracy and rights. But what Luce is saying is take that a step further. He says not only should we be content to sit back and be an example, but we should also actively market American freedom and democracy. If this sounds a little bit like imperialism to you, you are not wrong. Okay, so that America should aggressively promote their culture definitely does kind of smack a little bit of what we call cultural imperialism, right? Exporting your culture without directly controlling a nation's government. On the flip side of this, you have people like Henry Wallace, a politician who gave a speech titled The Price of Free World Victory in 1942. And rather than Luce's message, where America kind of needs to be this solo agent of global power and promote actively American ideas of freedom and democracy, Wallace said America's role should ideally be a team player in global politics, that we needed to work together as part of an international coalition to promote freedom, justice, and economic equality. So essentially, what Wallace is arguing for is kind of a global New Deal. Okay? In much the same way as progressives imagined World War I as a potential launching point for a worldwide progressive movement, Wallace is arguing for more economic justice, more social justice, like we saw in parts of the New Deal, and making that global. Okay? So Luce wants us to be a lone wolf exerting our power. Wallace wants us to use our power in a collaborative way with other nations to improve the world. Okay. We're going to talk in a later class about which of these ideas will play out. Spoiler alert, Henry Luce's will. Okay, for reasons we'll get to later. There's also this conversation of how we can protect Americans at home post-war. And in 1942 and 1943, the National Resources Planning Board, one of these wartime agencies, published a report in which they argued that the government should get involved to help guarantee employment and provide a system of welfare after World War II ended to make sure that all Americans had access to a basic standard of living. So, following that report in 1943, Franklin Delano Roosevelt started to promote what he called an economic Bill of Rights. So, starting in 1944, Roosevelt and the White House pitched to Congress an economic Bill of Rights that would ensure things like basic access to food, shelter, medical care, and employment. This was a big ask. This is a step up from Social Security, which had itself taken a monumental amount of debate and compromise to pass in 1935. In the end, the only part of the Economic Bill of Rights that will end up surviving and passing Congress is the GI Bill. So the GI Bill establishes this notion of basic standard of living for veterans. Okay? The GI Bill, which is still in place today, provides benefits like education, job trainings, a pension, and mortgage help to veterans. Now, this is no small feat considering the number of Americans who served in the military and would have access to these benefits following World War II. But access to these same level of benefits for the rest of the population, for civilians, would remain elusive to the general population in the 1940s. And in fact, the subject of our next segment is going to be talking about the experience of minorities during World War II and taking a closer look at how the war both provided a level of promise for a more hopeful future for some minority groups, and also for others illustrated just how long the struggle for equal civil liberties and rights was going to take following World War II.